The fluorescent lights of O'Malley's pub cast a harsh glow over the crowd of military personnel who had gathered for what had become their regular Friday night ritual. The establishment, located just outside Camp Pendleton, had earned a reputation as the unofficial watering hole for Marines looking to unwind after grueling weeks of training and deployment preparations. Tonight was no different, with the familiar sounds of clinking glasses, raucous laughter, and the occasional raised voice creating the backdrop for what would become an evening that would change everything. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson sat hunched over his third beer, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the scarred wooden bar. At 28, he carried himself with the swagger that came from 6 years of military service and multiple deployments to Afghanistan. His short-cropped brown hair and steel-gray eyes reflected a man who had seen more than his share of combat, and the slight tremor in his left hand, a souvenir from an IED explosion 2 years prior, served as a constant reminder of the price he had paid for his service. Marcus had always been what his fellow Marines called a straight shooter, someone who spoke his mind without filter and expected the world to operate according to the rigid hierarchy and clear-cut rules that govern military life. In his world, respect was earned through rank, actions, and proven leadership on the battlefield. Women, in his limited experience, were either wives of fellow Marines, nurses in field hospitals, or civilian contractors who stayed safely behind a wire. The concept of female combat leadership was something he intellectually understood but had never personally encountered in any meaningful way. The bar buzzed with animated conversations about upcoming exercises, deployment schedules, and the usual complaints about military bureaucracy. Marcus found himself growing increasingly agitated as he listened to Corporal Jenkins, a fresh-faced 22-year-old who had joined his unit 6 months earlier, complaining about new regulations that seemed to prioritize what Jenkins called political correctness over combat effectiveness. "It's all changing too fast," Jenkins muttered, taking a long pull from his beer bottle. "First they let women into combat roles. Now we've got to watch every word we say. Pretty soon they'll be telling us we can't call the enemy because it might hurt someone's feelings." Marcus nodded grimly, his frustration with the changing military landscape finding voice through Jenkins' complaints. "Tell me about it, kid. When I first enlisted, things were simpler. You knew who was in charge, you knew your place, and you knew that the person giving you orders had earned a right to do so through blood, sweat, and proven leadership. Now it feels like they're more concerned with checking boxes than with maintaining the standards that have kept this corps strong for over 2 centuries. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a group of Marines from a different unit, their voices carrying across the bar as they discussed their new commanding officer. Marcus couldn't help but overhear fragments of their conversation, and what he heard made his blood pressure rise. "I'm telling you, she's tough as nails," one of them was saying. "Tougher than half the male officers I've served under. The woman's got ice water in her veins." "Yeah, but it's still weird, you know," another voice chimed in. "Taking orders from a woman just doesn't feel natural. I mean, I respect her rank and all, but when push comes to shove in combat, I want someone leading me who I know can physically handle whatever comes our way." Marcus felt his jaw clench as he listened to the debate. The very idea that women were now serving in roles that he considered sacred ground for male Marines struck him as a fundamental betrayal of everything the Corps stood for. In his mind, the military wasn't a place for social experiments or gender equality initiatives. It was a war-fighting organization with a primary concern should always be mission effectiveness and the safety of the Marines under command. As the evening wore on, Marcus's mood grew increasingly dark. The combination of alcohol, frustration with military changes, and the stress of preparing for his upcoming deployment to Syria created a perfect storm of resentment that was looking for an outlet. He had been selected for a special operations assignment that would take him away from his unit for an extended period, and the uncertainty of working with new personnel, including the possibility of female leadership, gnawed at him. It was nearly 10 o'clock when she walked in. The woman who entered O'Malley's pub that Friday night carried herself with a quiet confidence that immediately caught the attention of several patrons. She was of average height, perhaps 5'6", with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and wearing civilian clothes that did nothing to diminish the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. Her green eyes swept the room with the practiced assessment of a professional who was always aware of her surroundings, and she moved with the economical grace of someone who had learned to navigate male-dominated spaces without calling unnecessary attention to herself. Admiral Sarah Mitchell had not planned to stop at O'Malley's that evening. She had been driving back to her quarters after a lengthy planning session at Camp Pendleton when she noticed her fuel gauge approaching empty. The gas station next to the pub had been her intended destination, but as she filled her tank, she found herself drawn to the warm light spilling from the establishment's windows. It had been a particularly challenging week of meetings with Pentagon officials who questioned every decision she made with a scrutiny that her male counterparts rarely faced, and the prospect of a quiet drink in anonymous surroundings appealed to her. At 45, Sarah had spent the last 23 years climbing the ranks of the Marine Corps through a combination of exceptional tactical acumen, unwavering dedication, and the kind of personal sacrifice that few outside the military could understand. She had earned her stars through combat leadership in Iraq, innovative thinking in strategic planning, and a reputation for fairness and competence that had won her the respect of subordinates and superiors alike. But tonight, dressed in jeans and a simple blouse, she was just another person looking for a moment of peace in a world that seemed to grow more complicated by the day. She approached the bar and settled onto a stool near the far end, deliberately choosing a spot that would allow her to observe the room while remaining relatively unobtrusive. The bartender, a grizzled former Marine named Pete who had been running O'Malley's for 15 years, recognized the bearing of a career military officer immediately, but respected the unspoken desire for anonymity that her civilian attire suggested. "What can I get you?" Pete asked with professional courtesy. "Bourbon neat," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came from years of projecting authority across parade grounds and briefing rooms. "Whatever you're pouring is fine." As Pete poured her drink, Sarah allowed herself to relax for the first time in days. The familiar sound of military conversations filled the air around her. Complaints about training schedules, discussions of deployment rotations, and the eternal griping about military food that was as much a part of Marine culture as the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor itself. For a moment, she felt the simple pleasure of being among her people, even if they were unaware of her presence and position. That moment of peace was shattered when she became aware of the increasingly loud and inappropriate conversation taking place just a few stools away from her position. Marcus had noticed the woman's arrival, but had initially dismissed her as just another military wife out for a drink while her husband was deployed. However, as his alcohol consumption continued and his inhibitions lowered, he found himself paying more attention to her presence. Something about her posture and the way she carried herself irritated him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. She seemed too comfortable, too confident in a space that he considered fundamentally masculine. "Look at that," he said to Jenkins, nodding in Sarah's direction, but making no effort to lower his voice. "Another civilian who thinks she belongs in a Marine bar. Probably some officer's wife trying to feel important by hanging around real warriors." Jenkins, already uncomfortable with his staff sergeant's increasing belligerence, tried to deflect the conversation. "Come on, Sarge. She's just having a drink. No harm in that." But Marcus was beyond reason at this point. The alcohol, combined with his frustration about military changes and his own insecurities about the upcoming deployment, had created a toxic mixture of aggression and poor judgment. "No, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of people who have never worn the uniform, never faced enemy fire, never had to make life or death decisions, acting like they understand what we do. This is our place, our sanctuary, and I'll be damned if I'm going to sit here and watch it get invaded by people who don't belong." Sarah, despite her attempt to maintain a low profile, couldn't help but overhear Marcus's comments. Every instinct honed by years of military leadership told her to address the situation immediately, but she also recognized that her intervention at this point would likely escalate rather than defuse the tension. She had learned through hard experience that sometimes the best leadership meant knowing when not to act, allowing situations to develop naturally before intervening. However, Marcus had no intention of allowing the matter to rest. Emboldened by what he perceived as silent agreement from his fellow Marines, and convinced that his actions were somehow defending the honor of the Corps, he stood up from his stool and approached Sarah's position at the bar. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness that barely concealed his hostility. "I couldn't help but notice that you seem a little lost. This is kind of military establishment, if you know what I mean. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Sarah turned to face him, her green eyes meeting his gray ones with a steady gaze that betrayed nothing of the storm of emotions raging within her. She had faced down enemy combatants, hostile Pentagon officials, and skeptical subordinates, but something about this moment felt different. This wasn't about professional competence or strategic decisions. This was about fundamental respect and the right to exist in a space that she had earned through sacrifice and service. "I appreciate your concern," she said calmly, "but I'm quite comfortable where I am." Her response, delivered with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, only served to further inflame Marcus's anger. In his alcohol-clouded judgment, her refusal to be intimidated represented everything wrong with the changing military culture. Here was someone who clearly didn't understand military hierarchy or respect, someone who thought they could stand up to a Marine staff sergeant with impunity. "Listen, lady," Marcus continued, stepping closer and lowering his voice to what he thought was a menacing whisper. "I don't think you understand the situation here. This isn't some civilian bar where you could just waltz in and make yourself at home. This is a place for Marines, for people who have earned the right to be here through service and sacrifice. You obviously haven't done either, so maybe it's time for you to find somewhere more appropriate for your kind." The bar had grown quieter as other patrons became aware of the confrontation developing near the end of the bar. Some watched with the morbid fascination that comes from witnessing a train wreck in slow motion, while others shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something significant was happening but unsure of how to respond. Sarah felt the familiar fire of anger building in her chest, the same emotion that had driven her through countless challenges and obstacles throughout her career. But alongside that anger was something else, a profound disappointment that one of her Marines could behave with such disrespect and ignorance. This wasn't just a personal affront. It was a reflection of everything that was still wrong with military culture, everything that she had spent decades fighting to change. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," she said quietly, reading his name taped despite the dim lighting, "I think you should reconsider your approach." The use of his rank and name stopped Marcus cold. How could this civilian woman possibly know his military rank and surname? The confusion was evident on his face as he stepped back slightly, trying to process this unexpected development. "How do you know?" he began, but Sarah cut him off with a slight raise of her hand. "I make it my business to know the Marines under my command," she said simply. "And right now, Staff Sergeant, you are representing the Marine Corps very poorly." The implications of her words began to sink in, but Marcus's alcohol-impaired reasoning led him to the wrong conclusion. She must be some kind of civilian contractor or Pentagon official who had access to personnel files. His anger, rather than diminishing, intensified at the thought that his behavior was being judged by someone outside the chain of command. "Oh, so you're one of those," he said with disdain. "Some bureaucrat who thinks looking at files makes you qualified to judge Marines. Well, let me tell you something, lady. I don't care what kind of clearance you have or what office you work in. You don't know anything about what it means to be a Marine, and you sure as hell don't have any authority over me." The confrontation had reached a tipping point. Sarah knew that her next words would determine not only how the situation resolved, but also what kind of lesson would be learned by every Marine watching this unfold. She could reveal her identity and rank immediately, using the shock value to shut down Marcus's behavior, but that would rob him, and everyone else present, of the opportunity to understand the deeper implications of what was happening. Instead, she made a decision that would change everything that followed. "You're absolutely right, Staff Sergeant," she said calmly. "I don't know what it means to be a Marine. Why don't you show me?" The challenge, delivered with such quiet confidence, caught Marcus completely off guard. He had expected her to back down, to reveal herself as the paper-pushing bureaucrat he had convinced himself she was. Instead, she was calling his bluff, asking him to demonstrate the very values he claimed she couldn't understand. For a moment, the bar was completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Marcus stood frozen, suddenly aware that he was at a crossroads that would define not only this moment, but potentially his entire career. The alcohol was still coursing through his system, clouding his judgment, but some small part of his mind recognized that something fundamental had shifted in the last few minutes. Sarah watched him struggle with the decision, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she felt a flicker of sympathy for the young man standing before her. She could see the confusion and uncertainty in his eyes, the gradual realization that he had stumbled into something much larger than he had anticipated. But she also knew that this was a teaching moment that could not be wasted, both for Marcus and for every other Marine who was watching this unfold. The next few moments would determine whether Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson would learn a lesson that would make him a better Marine and a better man, or whether his prejudices and misconceptions would be reinforced in a way that would damage both his career and the Corps he claimed to love. As the silence stretched on, Sarah waited patiently for his response, knowing that the choice was entirely his to make. The evening that had begun as a simple stop for fuel and a quiet drink had become something much more significant. A moment of truth that would reverberate far beyond the walls of O'Malley's pub and into the future of everyone present. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything Marcus thought he knew about leadership, respect, and what it truly meant to be a Marine. The silence that had settled over O'Malley's pub felt heavy with anticipation, like the moment before thunder follows lightning. Marcus Thompson stood frozen in place, his mind racing as he tried to process the unexpected turn the evening had taken. The woman before him maintained her calm composure, waiting patiently for his response to her challenge, while the other Marines in the bar watched with growing unease. Marcus's military training told him that something was seriously wrong with this situation, but his alcohol-impaired judgment and wounded pride prevented him from recognizing the warning signs that were becoming increasingly obvious to everyone else in the establishment. The way she carried herself, the confidence in her voice, the casual manner in which she had known his rank and name, all of these should have been clear indicators that he was dealing with someone far above his station. "You want me to show you what it means to be a Marine?" Marcus said, his voice slightly slurred but gaining strength as he convinced himself that he was defending some sacred principle. "Fine. Being a Marine means having the courage to tell people the truth, even when they don't want to hear it. And the truth is that the Corps isn't some social experiment where anyone can just walk in and demand respect they haven't earned." Sarah listened to his words with the patience of someone who had heard similar arguments countless times throughout her career. She had faced skepticism, hostility, and outright discrimination from Marines who couldn't see past their own preconceptions, but she had learned long ago that the most effective way to change minds was not through confrontation, but through demonstration. "I see," she replied calmly. "And how exactly does one earn that respect you're talking about?" The question seemed simple enough, but Marcus found himself struggling to articulate an answer that didn't sound rehearsed or hollow. "Through service," he said finally. "Through proving yourself in combat, through leading Marines in dangerous situations, through making the kind of sacrifices that most people can't even imagine." "That's an interesting perspective," Sarah said, taking a sip of her bourbon. "Tell me about your combat experience, Staff Sergeant. Where have you served?" The request caught Marcus off guard. He had expected her to back down or become defensive, not to engage him in what felt like a professional discussion. "Afghanistan," he said, some of the hostility leaving his voice as he found himself on more familiar ground. "2 deployments. Helmand Province, both times. Lost 3 good Marines on my second tour." For the first time since the confrontation began, Sarah's expression softened slightly. She could hear the pain in his voice when he mentioned his fallen comrades, and she recognized the weight of grief that every combat leader carried. "I'm sorry for your losses," she said sincerely. "Helmand was a difficult area. What unit were you with?" Marcus blinked, surprised by the genuine sympathy in her voice and the fact that she seemed to know something about the operational environment he had described. "3rd Battalion, 5th Marines," he said automatically. "We were operating out of FOB Shurgazay for most of the deployment." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. She was intimately familiar with 3rd Battalion's operations in Afghanistan, having been involved in planning several of their missions during her time as a colonel in the Marine Corps Operations Directorate. But she kept that information to herself for now, allowing Marcus to continue speaking. "The thing is," Marcus said, his voice becoming more animated as the alcohol and emotion combined to lower his inhibitions. "When you're out there in that kind of situation, you can't afford to have any doubts about the person next to you. You need to know that everyone in your unit has been tested, that they've proven they can handle the pressure. It's not about being sexist or anything like that. It's about survival." "I understand that concern," Sarah replied. "But how do you test someone's ability to handle pressure? Is it just about physical strength, or are there other qualities that matter?" Marcus frowned, sensing that there was more to her questions than casual curiosity, but still not grasping the full scope of what was happening. "It's about more than just strength," he admitted reluctantly. You need someone who can make tough decisions under fire, someone who won't panic when things go wrong, someone who can inspire confidence in their Marines. Those are all important qualities, Sarah agreed. And you believe that only men possess them? The question was posed without judgment or accusation, but it forced Marcus to confront the logical inconsistency in his position. He had just described leadership qualities that had nothing to do with gender, yet his entire argument was based on the assumption that women couldn't possess them. It's not that simple, he said, growing frustrated with what felt like a trap. Look, I'm sure there are some women who might be capable, but the military isn't a place to find out. The stakes are too high to risk it. Before Sarah could respond, Corporal Jenkins approached the pair, his young face pale with concern. Sarge, he said quietly, maybe we should head back to base. It's getting late, and you've got that briefing early tomorrow morning. Marcus turned to glare at his subordinate. I'm Fina Jenkins, just having a conversation with this lady about military policy. The way he emphasized the word lady made it clear that he still viewed Sarah as an outsider with no legitimate standing to discuss such matters. Jenkins glanced nervously at Sarah, then back at Marcus. Unlike his staff sergeant, Jenkins had been paying attention to the subtle clues that indicated this woman was not what she appeared to be. The way other Marines in the bar had started to distance themselves from the confrontation, the increasingly uncomfortable looks being exchanged among the senior enlisted personnel present, and, most importantly, the woman's own calm confidence in the face of increasingly aggressive behavior. Staff Sergeant, Jenkins said more urgently, I really think we should go. But Marcus was beyond listening to reason. The combination of alcohol, wounded pride, and what he perceived as interference from his subordinate only served to fuel his anger. Stand down, Corporal, he said sharply. I don't need a junior Marine telling me how to handle myself. The exchange between Marcus and Jenkins had not gone unnoticed by the other Marines in the bar. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who had been quietly nursing a beer at a corner table, stood up and began walking toward the confrontation. He had been watching the situation develop with growing alarm, recognizing signs that the younger Marines had missed. Rodriguez had served under enough senior officers to recognize command presence when he saw it, and everything about the woman at the bar screamed high-ranking military officer. The way she held herself, the calm confidence with which she handled the increasingly aggressive harassment, and, most tellingly, the fact that she hadn't backed down or left when things started to get uncomfortable. Thompson, Rodriguez said as he approached, his voice carrying the authority that came with 2 decades of military service. What's going on here? Marcus turned to face the Master Sergeant, his expression showing a mixture of relief and defiance. Just explaining some facts of life to this civilian, Master Sergeant. She seems to think she knows something about military operations. Rodriguez looked at Sarah, noting the slight smile that played at the corners of her mouth. She gave him an almost imperceptible shake of her head, indicating that she didn't want him to intervene directly. Rodriguez understood immediately. This was a teaching moment, and she was allowing it to play out for reasons that would become clear soon enough. I see, Rodriguez said carefully. And what exactly are these facts of life you're sharing? Marcus launched into a recap of his argument about military standards and the dangers of lowering them to accommodate political correctness. As he spoke, Rodriguez found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable, not just with the content of Marcus's words, but with the complete lack of situational awareness the younger Marine was displaying. Sarah listened patiently to Marcus's renewed tirade, occasionally asking questions that seemed designed to get him to elaborate on his views. To the casual observer, it might have appeared that she was genuinely interested in his perspective, but Rodriguez recognized the technique. She was giving Marcus enough rope to hang himself with, allowing him to fully commit to positions that would be impossible to defend once the truth came out. So you believe, Sarah said during a brief pause in Marcus's monologue, that combat effectiveness should be the only consideration in military leadership positions? Absolutely, Marcus said emphatically. Everything else is just politics and social engineering. The Corps exists to fight and win wars, not to make people feel better about themselves. And you think that someone who hasn't proven themselves in combat has no business leading Marines? That's exactly what I think. You can't understand what it means to be responsible for Marines' lives unless you've been there yourself, unless you've had to make those life and death decisions under fire. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That's a compelling argument, Staff Sergeant. It sounds like you have very high standards for military leadership. I do, Marcus said, feeling vindicated by what he interpreted as agreement with his position. And I'm not going to apologize for that. The Marines who served under me in Afghanistan deserved leaders who had proven themselves, not someone who got their position because it looked good on a diversity report. The comment hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger that came from hearing her life's work and sacrifices dismissed so casually. But she maintained her composure, recognizing that Marcus's words revealed more about his own insecurities and limitations than they did about her qualifications or those of any other female Marine. I can understand why you feel that way, she said calmly. It must be difficult to accept leadership from someone you perceive as unqualified. It's not about perception, Marcus insisted. It's about reality. I've seen what happens when people are put in positions they can't handle. Good Marines die because of political decisions made by people who have never faced enemy fire. Have you ever served under a female officer, staff sergeant? The question caught Marcus off guard. No, he admitted reluctantly. My unit commanders have all been men. So your opinions about female leadership are based on theoretical concerns rather than actual experience? Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath him, but couldn't quite identify why. Sometimes you don't need direct experience to know something is wrong, he said defensively. Some things are just common sense. I see. And what about enlisted leadership? Have you ever served under a female senior enlisted advisor? No, but that's different. Enlisted leadership is more about technical expertise and administrative support. Combat leadership requires different qualities. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Different qualities? Such as? Marcus found himself struggling to articulate specific qualities that were inherently masculine without sounding overtly sexist. It's about presence, he said finally. About commanding respect through strength and experience. About being someone that Marines will follow in a battle without question. And you believe that respect can only be commanded by men. The question forced Marcus to confront the fundamental assumption underlying his entire argument. He had been trying to frame his objections in terms of practical military concerns, but Sarah's patient questioning was revealing the gender-based prejudices that actually drove his thinking. Look, he said, growing increasingly agitated, I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to make me sound like some kind of sexist dinosaur. But I'm not talking about politics or social issues. I'm talking about life and death, about the sacred responsibility that comes with leading Marines in combat. I'm not trying to make you sound like anything, Staff Sergeant. I'm simply trying to understand your perspective. You've argued that combat experience and proven leadership under fire are essential qualifications for military commanders. Is that correct? Yes, absolutely. And that anyone lacking these qualifications has no business leading Marines? That's right. Sarah nodded slowly, her green eyes never leaving his face. Then, I think it's time we clarified exactly who you're talking to. The moment had arrived. Sarah reached in her back pocket and withdrew a black leather wallet, which she placed on the bar between them. With deliberate care, she opened it to reveal her military identification card, turning it so that Marcus could clearly see the photograph, name, and, most importantly, the rank insignia that identified her as a United States Marine Corps Admiral. The effect was immediate and devastating. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, shock, and, finally, the pale realization of exactly how catastrophically he had misjudged the situation. The blood drained from his face as the implications of what he had done began to sink in. Admiral Sarah Mitchell, she said calmly, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had been there all along but which Marcus had been too blind to recognize. United States Marine Corps. 23 years of service, including combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. I've commanded Marines at every level from platoon to division, and I currently serve as the commanding officer of Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. The silence that followed was deafening. Every Marine in the bar had heard the revelation, and the atmosphere had shifted from uncomfortable tension to something approaching panic among those who understood the full scope of what had just transpired. Master Sergeant Rodriguez closed his eyes and shook his head slightly. He had seen careers end for much less serious offenses than what he had just witnessed. Corporal Jenkins looked like he was about to be sick, his young face reflecting the horror of someone who understood that he was witnessing a career-ending moment for his staff sergeant. Marcus stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words that could somehow undo what had just happened. The woman he had been harassing and lecturing about military standards was not only a Marine, but one of the most senior Marines in the entire Corps. Everything he had said about combat experience and proven leadership applied to her far more than it did to him, and he had delivered his ignorant opinions directly to someone who outranked him by several levels. "Ma'am," he finally managed to stammer, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, seeing the shock and fear written there. She had been in this position before, dealing with Marines who had let their prejudices override their judgment, but something about Marcus's obvious distress gave her pause. This wasn't malicious hatred. It was ignorance and misguided loyalty to an institution he didn't fully understand. "No, Staff Sergeant," she said quietly, "you didn't know. The question is, what are you going to do with what you know now?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that extended far beyond this single evening. Marcus's next words and actions would determine not only his immediate future, but the kind of Marine and the kind of man he would become going forward. As he struggled to form a response, Sarah waited patiently, understanding that this was one of those pivotal moments that would define a person's character for years to come. The weight of Admiral Mitchell's question pressed down on Marcus Thompson like a physical force, threatening to crush him under the enormity of his mistake. The alcohol that had fueled his aggression now seemed to mock him, clouding his thoughts when he needed clarity most. Around him, the bar had fallen into an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the nervous shifting of Marines who suddenly found themselves witnesses to what could become a defining moment in Corps history. Marcus felt his hands trembling as the full scope of his actions began to crystallize in his mind. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or poor judgment. He had spent the better part of an hour systematically disrespecting and harassing one of the most senior officers in the Marine Corps. Every word he had spoken, every assumption he had made, every prejudice he had revealed now stood as evidence of his fundamental failure as a Marine. "Admiral," he began, his voice cracking slightly as he struggled to find the right words. There's no excuse for what I've done tonight. No excuse for how I've spoken to you or for the assumptions I've made." He paused, swallowing hard as he tried to organize thoughts that seemed to scatter like leaves in a hurricane. "I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't begin to address the seriousness of my conduct, but I need you to know that my behavior tonight doesn't represent who I want to be as a Marine." Sarah listened to his words, noting the genuine distress in his voice, but also recognizing the careful phrasing that suggested he was already thinking about damage control rather than true understanding. She had seen this response before, the panicked realization followed by attempts to minimize consequences rather than confront the underlying issues that had led to the situation. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," she said calmly, "I appreciate your acknowledgement, but I'm not interested in apologies right now. What I want to understand is why you felt qualified to judge my worthiness to be in this establishment without knowing anything about my background or service record." The question struck at the heart of Marcus's worldview, forcing him to examine assumptions that he had never seriously questioned. He had built his identity around being a Marine, around belonging to an exclusive brotherhood that set him apart from civilians and lesser military personnel. The idea that someone could outrank him so dramatically while remaining invisible to his recognition challenged everything he thought he understood about military hierarchy and respect. "I made assumptions based on appearance," he said slowly, each word feeling like pulling teeth. "I saw a woman in civilian clothes in what I considered a military space, and I let my preconceptions override my judgment. I thought." He paused, struggling with the admission. "I thought I knew what a senior Marine officer looked like, and it never occurred to me that my mental image could be wrong." Corporal Jenkins, who had been standing frozen throughout the exchange, finally found the courage to speak. "Admiral, ma'am," he said, his young voice shaking with nervousness, "if I could, that is, I want you to know that Staff Sergeant Thompson is normally not like this. He's a good Marine who's done multiple combat deployments, and I think maybe the stress of preparing for Syria and the alcohol." His words trailed off as he realized that making excuses might only make things worse. Sarah turned her attention to Jenkins, studying the young Marine's earnest face. She could see the loyalty he felt toward his staff sergeant, even in the face of such obvious wrongdoing, and she recognized the difficult position he was in. "Corporal Jenkins," she said, How long have you been serving under Staff Sergeant Thompson? About 8 months, ma'am, since I finished infantry school and was assigned to his squad. And in that time, how has he treated you and the other Marines in your unit? Jenkins glanced nervously at Marcus before answering. He's been a good leader, ma'am. Demanding but fair. He looks out for his Marines, make sure we're properly trained and equipped. He stayed with Corporal Martinez for 6 hours in the field hospital when Martinez got hurt during a training exercise, even though he was off duty. The information painted a more complex picture than Sarah had initially perceived. The man who had harassed her was clearly capable of genuine leadership and concern for his subordinates, which meant his behavior tonight represented a specific blind spot rather than general character deficiencies. I see, Sarah said thoughtfully. So this behavior is aberrant for Staff Sergeant Thompson? Yes, ma'am. Completely. I've never seen him act like this before. Sarah turned back to Marcus, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. The fact that his subordinate was willing to defend him despite what had just transpired spoke well of the relationships he had built within his unit, but it also raised questions about why those same leadership qualities had failed him so completely tonight. Staff Sergeant, she said, you've heard Corporal Jenkins's assessment of your leadership. Do you believe his description is accurate? Marcus nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. I try to take care of my Marines to prepare them for whatever they might face in combat. It's the most important part of my job. Then, help me understand how someone who cares deeply about Marines and military standards could behave the way you did tonight. Because from my perspective, your conduct was completely incompatible with the values you claim to hold. The question forced Marcus to confront the uncomfortable truth that his actions had been driven by fear and insecurity rather than principle. He had been so threatened by the idea of women in combat roles that he had lashed out at the first opportunity, revealing prejudices that he had convinced himself were professional concerns. I've been struggling with changes in the Corps, he admitted reluctantly. I enlisted at a time when things seemed more straightforward. The rules were clear, the hierarchy was obvious, and I knew my place in the system. Lately, it feels like everything is changing faster than I can adapt to it, and I guess I've been looking for someone to blame for my discomfort. Sarah nodded, recognizing the honesty in his admission. She had seen similar reactions from other Marines who felt displaced by evolving military culture, and she understood that resistance to change often masked deeper fears about relevance and belonging. Change is never easy, she said, especially in an institution that values tradition as much as the Marine Corps does. But tell me something, Staff Sergeant. Do you believe that your discomfort with change justifies the way you treated me tonight? No, ma'am. Absolutely not. My personal struggles don't excuse disrespecting a superior officer or making assumptions based on gender. I let my fears and prejudices override my training and my values. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been listening to the conversation while trying to assess the mood of the other Marines in the bar, finally stepped forward. Admiral, he said, if I may, Staff Sergeant Thompson has a solid service record and a good reputation as a squad leader. What happened tonight was clearly wrong, but I believe it represents a failure of judgment rather than character. Sarah appreciated Rodriguez's intervention, recognizing that he was trying to provide perspective while not excusing Marcus's behavior. Master Sergeant, you've been in the Corps for 20 years. How would you advise a young Marine who had just demonstrated such poor judgment? Rodriguez considered the question carefully. Ma'am, I tell him that this is one of those moments that defines a career, not because of what happened, but because of what he does next. The Corps values Marines who can learn from their mistakes and grow into better leaders. But it has no place for those who make excuses or fail to take responsibility for their actions. The weight of Rodriguez's words seemed to settle on Marcus like a heavy blanket. He understood that his career hung in the balance, but more than that, he realized that his entire understanding of what it meant to be a Marine was being challenged. Admiral, Marcus said, his voice steadier now as he found his footing, Master Sergeant Rodriguez is right. This is a defining moment for me, and I need to own it completely. I've spent 6 years thinking I understood what the Marine Corps stands for, but tonight has shown me that I've been operating from a narrow and prejudiced perspective. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. You asked me earlier what I was going to do with what I know now. Here's what I know. I know that I've been a hypocrite. I've talked about earning respect through service and sacrifice while failing to show that same respect to a Marine who has given far more to the Corps than I have. I know that my prejudices have made me a weaker Marine and a worse leader. And I know that if I want to continue serving in this Corps, I need to fundamentally change how I think about leadership and respect. Sarah listened to his words, hearing something different in his voice now. Not just fear of consequences, but genuine recognition of the deeper issues at stake. Those are important realizations, Staff Sergeant. But recognition is just the first step. What specific actions are you prepared to take to address these issues? Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would commit him to a path that would be difficult and potentially career-defining. Ma'am, I request the opportunity to undergo diversity and inclusion training beyond what's currently required. I want to understand how my attitudes have been shaped and how I can change them. I also request a chance to learn about the service records of senior female Marines, including your own, so I can educate myself about contributions I've been ignorant of. He paused, then continued with visible effort. And I want to apologize personally to every female Marine in my unit for any behavior or comments that may have created a hostile environment. I realize now that my attitudes probably came through in ways I wasn't even aware of, and they deserved better from their leader. The offer was more comprehensive than Sarah had expected, and she found herself reassessing her initial judgment of Marcus's character. Many Marines in his position would have focused solely on avoiding punishment, but his proposal suggested a genuine desire for personal growth. Those are constructive suggestions, she said. But I want to be clear about something, Staff Sergeant. This isn't just about completing training or going through the motions of personal development. If you're serious about changing, it will require confronting some uncomfortable truths about yourself and the assumptions you've been operating under. I understand, ma'am, and I'm prepared for that. What happened tonight has been a wake-up call that I can't ignore. Corporal Jenkins, who had been watching the exchange with growing hope, stepped forward again. Admiral, if I may, Staff Sergeant Thompson has always told us that the best leaders are those who can admit their mistakes and learn from them. Maybe this is his chance to demonstrate that principle. Sarah smiled slightly at Jenkins's words, recognizing the loyalty and optimism of youth, but also appreciating his attempt to find redemption in a difficult situation. Corporal, you've shown remarkable loyalty to your staff sergeant tonight. That speaks well of the relationship he's built with his Marines. But I want you to understand something important. True loyalty sometimes means holding our leaders accountable when they fall short of our standards. Jenkins nodded seriously. Yes, ma'am. I understand. And I think maybe I should have spoken up earlier tonight when I first realized this was getting out of hand. That's a mature assessment, Corporal. Leadership isn't just about rank. It's about having the courage to do the right thing even when it's difficult. The conversation had evolved beyond simple discipline into something more complex and potentially transformative. Sarah found herself considering options she hadn't expected to explore when the evening began. The easy path would be to file a report and let the military justice system handle Marcus's conduct, but the harder and potentially more valuable approach would be to use this as a teaching moment that could benefit not just Marcus, but the entire Corps. Staff Sergeant Thompson, she said finally, I'm going to make you an offer. But before I do, I want you to understand that this is not about avoiding consequences for your actions tonight. There will still be official documentation of this incident, and it will become part of your service record. Are you clear on that? Marcus nodded, his expression serious. Yes, ma'am. I understand and accept that. Good. Here's what I'm proposing. You will report to my office Monday morning at 0800. For the next month, you will spend 2 hours each day learning about the history of women in the Marine Corps, the challenges they've faced, and the contributions they've made. You will write a detailed report analyzing your own attitudes and the changes you believe are necessary in Corps culture. And you will present your findings to a panel of senior officers, including several female Marines. The proposal was both punishment and opportunity, requiring Marcus to confront his prejudices while providing a path toward redemption. Additionally, Sarah continued, you will undergo formal mentorship with Colonel Rebecca Santos, one of the most respected female combat veterans in the Corps. She will evaluate your progress and determine whether you're genuinely committed to change. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at the offer. It represented a second chance he knew he didn't deserve, but It also committed him to a process that would be professionally and personally challenging. "Ma'am," he said, "I accept your offer gratefully. I know I don't deserve this opportunity, but I promise you that I will approach it with complete seriousness and commitment." Sarah nodded, then turned to address the other Marines who had been watching the exchange. "I want everyone here to understand something," she said, her voice carrying easily across the now silent bar. "What happened tonight is not an isolated incident. It reflects broader cultural issues that we need to address as a Corps. Every Marine in this room has a responsibility to examine their own attitudes and to speak up when they witness behavior that falls short of our standards." The message was clear and unmistakable. This was bigger than one staff sergeant's poor judgment. It was about the kind of organization the Marine Corps wanted to be and the values it wanted to embody. As the immediate crisis seemed to be resolving, Sarah felt the exhaustion of the evening settling on her shoulders. What had begun as a simple stop for a drink had become an intensive leadership moment that had required every bit of her experience and judgment to navigate successfully. But even as she prepared to leave, she knew that the real work was just beginning. Marcus's transformation, if it occurred at all, would take months of sustained effort, and there was no guarantee that he would prove capable of the fundamental change required. The broader cultural issues that his behavior had revealed would take years to address fully. Still, as she looked at the young Marine standing before her, she allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. Sometimes the most profound changes began with the most difficult conversations, and tonight had certainly qualified on that count. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that often follows a storm, and Marcus Thompson found himself standing outside Admiral Mitchell's office at 0750, 10 minutes early for an appointment that would determine the trajectory of the rest of his military career. The weekend had passed in a blur of sleepless nights, endless replaying of Friday evening's events, and painful conversations with himself about the man he had become versus the Marine he thought he was. He had spent Saturday morning writing and rewriting a formal apology letter, each draft revealing new layers of his misconduct that he hadn't fully grasped in the immediate aftermath. The more he reflected on his behavior, the more he understood that Admiral Mitchell had shown him extraordinary mercy by offering him a path toward redemption rather than simply destroying his career outright. The hallway outside the Admiral's office was quiet except for the soft murmur of conversations from nearby offices and the occasional sound of footsteps on polished floors. Marcus wore his dress blue uniform, every detail inspected and perfect, as if military precision could somehow compensate for his failure of character. The weight of his service ribbons felt different now, less like badges of honor and more like reminders of standards he had failed to uphold. At exactly 0800, Admiral Mitchell's aide, a sharp-eyed staff sergeant named Patricia Coleman, opened the office door and gestured for Marcus to enter. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, the Admiral will see you now." Marcus entered the office and immediately came to attention, his eyes fixed on a point just above Admiral Mitchell's head as he waited for permission to speak. The office was exactly what he would have expected from a senior Marine officer: functional furniture, maps of global Marine Corps operations, and photographs showing the Admiral with various military leaders and units throughout her career. "Staff Sergeant Thompson reporting as ordered, ma'am," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through his system. "Take a seat, Staff Sergeant," Admiral Mitchell said, gesturing to a chair positioned in front of her desk. She was wearing her service uniform, and in the morning light streaming through her office windows, Marcus could clearly see the combat ribbons and decorations that told the story of a distinguished military career. The Bronze Star with Combat V, the Navy Commendation Medal with Combat Distinguishing Device, and multiple campaign ribbons painted a picture of service that far exceeded his own. As Marcus settled into the chair, Admiral Mitchell studied him carefully. The arrogant, alcohol-fueled aggression of Friday night had been replaced by something more complex: genuine remorse mixed with uncertainty about what came next. She had dealt with enough disciplinary cases throughout her career to recognize the difference between Marines who were sorry they got caught and those who were genuinely committed to change. "Staff Sergeant," she began, "before we discuss your training program, I want you to understand exactly what happened Friday night from my perspective. I wasn't just a woman being harassed in a bar. I was a Marine Corps Admiral witnessing one of my Marines demonstrate complete ignorance of the values we claim to hold sacred. Marcus felt the words hit him like physical blows, each one precisely calibrated to drive home the magnitude of his failure. Yes, ma'am. I understand that now. Do you? Because I'm not sure you fully grasped the implications of what occurred. You didn't just insult me personally. You revealed an attitude that undermines unit cohesion, degrades combat effectiveness, and dishonors every Marine who has sacrificed for this corps regardless of gender. The Admiral paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. Your behavior suggests that you've been operating under the assumption that respect is something you can choose to give or withhold based on your personal prejudices. But respect in the Marine Corps isn't optional, Staff Sergeant. It's not based on your comfort level or your personal opinions about who belongs in our ranks. Marcus struggled to find words adequate to respond to the devastatingly accurate assessment of his conduct. Ma'am, you're absolutely right. I've been thinking about respect as something to be earned according to my own narrow criteria, rather than something inherent to the uniform and the values it represents. Admiral Mitchell nodded slightly. That's a start. But understanding the problem intellectually is different from changing your fundamental attitudes. What I want to know is whether you're prepared for the kind of deep personal work that real change requires. Yes, ma'am. I am. We'll see. Admiral Mitchell opened a thick folder on her desk and removed several documents. This is your training curriculum for the next month. You'll spend 2 hours each morning in this office, reading historical accounts, service records, and policy documents related to women in the Marine Corps. You'll research the careers of female Marines who have served with distinction in combat roles, and you'll analyze the institutional barriers they've had to overcome. She handed him the first set of materials, a collection of documents that appeared to span decades of Marine Corps history. Your first assignment is to read about the Women's Reserve during World War II. I want you to understand how female Marines served their country with honor during our most crucial historical period, and I want you to consider why that service was largely forgotten or minimized in the decades that followed. Marcus accepted the documents, noting their substantial weight. Yes, ma'am. How detailed should my analysis be? You'll write a minimum of 1,000 words each day analyzing what you've read and connecting it to current Corps policies and culture. But more importantly, you'll examine your own attitudes and identify specific instances where your thinking has been shaped by bias rather than facts. The requirement was more comprehensive than Marcus had expected, but he recognized that Admiral Mitchell was offering him an education rather than just punishment. I understand, ma'am. May I ask, why are you giving me this opportunity instead of simply processing me for disciplinary action? Admiral Mitchell leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus's face as she considered how to answer his question. Because I believe the Marine Corps is stronger when we help Marines grow rather than simply discarding them when they fall short. But also because your unit speaks well of your leadership, and I think you might have the potential to become part of the solution rather than just another example of the problem. She paused, then continued with increased intensity. However, I want to be absolutely clear about something, Staff Sergeant. This is not a participation trophy program. If you approach this training with anything less than complete commitment, if you treat it as something to endure rather than embrace, I will recommend your immediate discharge from the Marine Corps. Are we clear? Crystal clear, ma'am. Good. You'll also be meeting twice weekly with Colonel Rebecca Santos, whom I mentioned Friday night. She's currently assigned to Marine Corps headquarters as the Director of Leadership Development, and she has more combat experience than most male Marines I know. She'll be evaluating not just your progress in the training program, but your genuine commitment to change. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of accountability that was being built into his rehabilitation process. When will I meet with Colonel Santos? Tomorrow at 1400. And, Staff Sergeant, I suggest you approach that meeting with humility and genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness. Colonel Santos has dealt with Marines who think women don't belong in combat roles, and she has very little patience for those who aren't serious about learning. The warning was clear, and Marcus understood that he would be under intense scrutiny for the foreseeable future. Any sign of the attitudes that had led to Friday night's confrontation would likely end his Marine Corps career immediately. Admiral Mitchell stood up, indicating that the formal portion of their meeting was concluding. You'll report here every morning at 0800 for the next month. The materials you'll be studying are located in the conference room next door, and you'll have access to classified databases that contain detailed information about female Marine service records. As Marcus prepared to leave, Admiral Mitchell spoke again. Staff Sergeant, one final thing. I want you to understand that this isn't just about you learning to tolerate female Marines or going through the motions of cultural sensitivity training. This is about you becoming the kind of leader who can see past his own limitations and prejudices to recognize excellence wherever it exists. Marcus turned back to face her. Ma'am, I promise you that I will approach this training with complete seriousness. Not because I want to avoid consequences, but because I realize that I need to fundamentally change how I think about leadership and service. We'll see, Admiral Mitchell repeated. Actions will speak louder than promises, Staff Sergeant. Dismissed. As Marcus left the Admiral's office, he felt the enormous weight of the task ahead of him. This wasn't just about completing a training program or writing reports. It was about confronting decades of assumptions and rebuilding his understanding of what it meant to be a Marine. The conference room next door contained several tables covered with documents, books, and binders organized by historical period and topic. A computer terminal provided access to personnel databases and classified historical records. The scope of material was overwhelming, suggesting that Admiral Mitchell expected him to gain a comprehensive understanding of issues he had never seriously considered. Marcus began with the World War II materials, immediately encountering stories that challenged his preconceptions about women's military service. The Women's Reserve had performed crucial roles in intelligence, communications, and logistics, freeing male Marines for combat duties while maintaining the operational effectiveness that had been crucial to victory in the Pacific theater. As he read accounts of women who had served with distinction under difficult conditions, often facing skepticism and hostility from male colleagues, Marcus began to recognize uncomfortable parallels to his own attitudes. These women had proven their competence and dedication repeatedly, yet they had been marginalized and forgotten by institutional narratives that focused exclusively on male combat heroics. One account particularly struck him, the story of Master Sergeant Barbara Crawford, who had managed critical intelligence operations during the Battle of Iwo Jima while dealing with constant questions about her qualifications and right to be in her position. Her personnel file contained commendations from senior officers praising her exceptional performance under pressure, but also documented numerous instances of harassment and discrimination that had been dismissed as personality conflicts. Marcus found himself wondering how many talented Marines had been lost to the Corps because of attitudes like his own. How many potential leaders had been driven away by the kind of behavior he had displayed Friday night. The thought was profoundly uncomfortable, but he recognized that discomfort was probably necessary for real change to occur. By the end of his first morning in the program, Marcus had filled several pages with notes and observations, but more importantly, he had begun to understand the scope of his ignorance. The history of women in the Marine Corps was far richer and more complex than he had ever imagined, filled with examples of courage, competence, and sacrifice that equaled or exceeded anything he had witnessed among male Marines. As he prepared to leave for the day, Marcus reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. A week ago, he had been confident in his understanding of military hierarchy and his place within it. Now he was beginning a journey that would require him to question fundamental assumptions about leadership, respect, and what it truly meant to serve as a Marine. The path ahead would not be easy. Admiral Mitchell had made it clear that she expected nothing less than complete transformation, and he was beginning to understand just how challenging that would be. But for the first time since Friday night, Marcus felt something approaching hope, not just for his career, but for the possibility of becoming the kind of Marine he had always claimed to be, but had never quite achieved. Tomorrow would bring his first meeting with Colonel Santos, and he knew that would represent another crucial test of his commitment to change. But tonight, he would read more about the women who had served before him and try to understand how their experiences could inform his own journey toward becoming a better leader and a better Marine. 6 months after that transformative night at O'Malley's pub, Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson stood before a panel of senior Marine Corps officers in a conference room at Marine Corps Base Quantico, preparing to present the culmination of what had become the most challenging and rewarding period of his military career. The intensive training program that Admiral Mitchell had designed for him had evolved far beyond its original scope, becoming a comprehensive examination of leadership, bias, and the evolving culture of the Marine Corps. The panel before him represented a cross-section of Marine Corps leadership: Admiral Mitchell, Colonel Rebecca Santos, Major General Patricia Williams, Colonel James Rodriguez, and Lieutenant Colonel Michael Chen. Each had played a role in his transformation over the past months, and their presence here represented both validation of his progress and a final test of his commitment to change. Marcus had changed dramatically since that night at O'Malley's, both professionally and personally. The angry, defensive Marine who had harassed Admiral Mitchell had been replaced by someone more thoughtful, more humble, and infinitely more aware of his own limitations and potential for growth. The transformation hadn't been easy. It had required confronting uncomfortable truths about himself and dismantling assumptions that had shaped his worldview for decades. "Good morning," Marcus began, his voice steady and confident without the underlying aggression that had once characterized his speech. "6 months ago, I stood before Admiral Mitchell as a Marine who thought he understood what leadership meant. I was wrong about almost everything." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing with what would be the most important presentation of his career. "Today, I want to share what I've learned about leadership, about respect, and about what it truly means to serve as a United States Marine." The first part of his presentation focused on the historical research he had conducted under Admiral Mitchell's guidance. He spoke about the Women's Reserve Marines of World War II, their crucial contributions to the war effort, and the institutional amnesia that had erased their stories from official Corps narratives. He discussed the integration of women into combat roles, the challenges they had faced, and the exceptional performance that many had demonstrated under the most demanding conditions. But the historical analysis was just the foundation for deeper insights about leadership and organizational culture. Marcus had spent months examining not just what women had contributed to the Marine Corps, but why their contributions had been minimized or ignored, and what that revealed about the institution's values and blind spots. "What I discovered," Marcus continued, "was that my attitudes weren't just personal prejudices. They were part of a broader cultural pattern that has limited the Marine Corps' effectiveness by excluding or marginalizing talented individuals based on characteristics that have nothing to do with their ability to lead or fight." Colonel Santos, who had served as his primary mentor throughout the program, watched his presentation with careful attention. Their weekly sessions had been intense, often confrontational affairs that had forced Marcus to examine his deepest assumptions about gender, leadership, and military culture. She had been skeptical initially about his commitment to change, but over time had witnessed a genuine transformation that impressed her despite her reservations. Marcus moved to the most personal part of his presentation, discussing how his attitudes had been shaped by limited experience, cultural messaging, and his own insecurities about his place in a changing military environment. He spoke honestly about the fear and uncertainty that had driven his behavior at O'Malley's, acknowledging that his harassment of Admiral Mitchell had been an attempt to assert dominance in a situation where he felt his authority and relevance were being challenged. "I want to be clear about something," he said, looking directly at Admiral Mitchell. "What I did that night wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment caused by alcohol or stress. It was the inevitable result of attitudes and assumptions that I had been carrying for years. The alcohol didn't create my prejudices, it just revealed them." The acknowledgement was crucial, demonstrating that Marcus understood the deep-rooted nature of the problem he had been working to address. Too many Marines in similar situations focused on external factors rather than accepting responsibility for their fundamental attitudes and beliefs. Admiral Mitchell nodded slightly, recognizing the significance of Marcus's admission. Throughout the training program, she had been watching for signs that he was engaging in genuine self-reflection rather than simply telling her what he thought she wanted to hear. This level of honesty and self-awareness suggested that his transformation might be sustainable. Marcus then presented his analysis of current Marine Corps culture, identifying specific policies, practices, and informal traditions that created barriers for female Marines and other underrepresented groups. His research had revealed how seemingly neutral policies often had disproportionate impacts, how informal networks excluded women from crucial professional development opportunities, and how cultural messaging reinforced stereotypes that limited everyone's potential. The Marine Corps talks about being an elite organization that selects and develops the best leaders regardless of background, Marcus said. But my research suggests that we often fail to live up to that standard. We allow bias to influence decisions about assignments, promotions, and opportunities in ways that weaken our overall capabilities. The critique was sharp but constructive, reflecting Marcus's growing ability to think systematically about organizational issues rather than just focusing on individual cases. Colonel Rodriguez, who had been present at O'Malley's that night, was struck by the intellectual rigor that Marcus brought to his analysis. This wasn't just sensitivity training, it was serious organizational development work. The final portion of Marcus's presentation focused on specific recommendations for improving Marine Corps culture and reducing the kind of bias that had characterized his own thinking. He proposed changes to training programs, mentorship structures, and evaluation criteria that could help create more inclusive environments without compromising military standards. His recommendations were detailed and practical, reflecting months of research into best practices from other military services and civilian organizations. He had studied successful integration efforts, interviewed female Marines about their experiences, and analyzed data on retention and promotion patterns that revealed persistent inequities. Change isn't just about individual attitude adjustments, Marcus concluded. It requires systematic changes to how we recruit, train, assign, and promote Marines. And it requires leaders at every level who are committed to creating environments where everyone can perform to their full potential. When Marcus finished his presentation, the room fell silent as the panel members absorbed what they had heard. Admiral Mitchell was particularly struck by the depth of analysis and the genuine transformation that the presentation represented. This wasn't the same Marine who had confronted her 6 months earlier. This was someone who had fundamentally rebuilt his understanding of leadership and military service. Colonel Santos was the first to speak. Staff Sergeant Thompson, your presentation demonstrates remarkable growth and insight. But I want to know how you plan to apply these lessons in your future assignments. Understanding is one thing. Implementation is another. Marcus had been expecting this question and had prepared carefully for it. Ma'am, I've requested assignment to a position where I can directly contribute to leadership development and cultural change. I want to work with junior Marines who might be struggling with the same issues I faced and help them develop more mature and effective approaches to leadership. The request represented a significant career pivot for Marcus. Instead of pursuing traditional combat leadership roles that would have advanced his military career more quickly, he was choosing to focus on institutional development work that would allow him to address the cultural issues he had come to understand so deeply. Major General Williams, who had been listening intently throughout the presentation, leaned forward in her chair. Staff Sergeant, you've described a comprehensive transformation in your thinking. But how do we know this change is genuine and sustainable rather than just an elaborate performance designed to save your career? The question was direct and challenging, but Marcus had been expecting it. Throughout the training program, he had struggled with the same concern. Was he genuinely changing, or was he simply becoming better at saying the right things? Ma'am, I can't prove that my change is genuine through words alone. The only way to demonstrate authenticity is through consistent actions over time. What I can tell you is that this process has changed how I see everything. Not just women in the military, but leadership, respect, and what it means to serve something larger than myself. He paused, then continued with visible emotion. 6 months ago, I thought strength meant dominating others, and respect meant demanding deference. Now I understand that real strength comes from empowering others, and genuine respect is something you give freely rather than something you hoard for people who meet your arbitrary criteria. Admiral Mitchell watched Marcus carefully as he spoke, noting the sincerity in his voice and the thoughtful way he approached each question. She had seen many Marines attempt to rehabilitation after serious mistakes, but few had demonstrated the kind of comprehensive change that Marcus appeared to have undergone. The panel spent another hour questioning Marcus about specific scenarios, testing his understanding and commitment through hypothetical situations that might challenge his newfound perspectives. His responses demonstrated not just intellectual understanding, but genuine internalization of the principles he had learned. Finally, Admiral Mitchell called for a brief recess so the panel could deliberate privately about Marcus's future. As he waited outside the conference room, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The angry, defensive Marine who had started this process seemed like a different person entirely, someone whose limitations and prejudices had been holding back not just his own potential, but that of every Marine around him. When the panel reconvened, Admiral Mitchell delivered their decision with the same quiet authority she had displayed that night at O'Malley's. Staff Sergeant Thompson, this panel has concluded that you have demonstrated genuine commitment to personal and professional growth. Your transformation over the past 6 months has been remarkable, and we believe you can make meaningful contributions to improving Marine Corps culture. Marcus felt a surge of relief and gratitude, but Admiral Mitchell wasn't finished. However, we want to be clear that this is not the end of your development process. It's the beginning. You will be assigned to the Leadership Development Division at Marine Corps University, where you will work on programs designed to prevent the kind of cultural issues that led to your original misconduct. The assignment was both an opportunity and a responsibility. Marcus would be working directly on the institutional changes he had recommended, but he would also be held to the highest standards of conduct and performance. Additionally, Admiral Mitchell continued, you will serve as a mentor to other Marines who have demonstrated similar cultural blind spots. Your experience and transformation can help others avoid the mistakes you made and develop more effective leadership approaches. As Marcus accepted his new assignment, he understood that his journey was far from over. The real test would come in his ability to apply what he had learned in practical leadership situations, working with Marines who might be struggling with the same issues he had faced. But for the first time since that night at O'Malley's, Marcus felt genuinely hopeful about his future as a Marine. He had discovered that true strength came not from asserting dominance over others, but from helping them discover their own potential. He had learned that respect was not something to be rationed based on personal prejudices, but something to be given freely to all who wore the uniform. Most importantly, he had come to understand that being a Marine meant something far more complex and meaningful than he had ever imagined. It meant being part of an institution that was constantly evolving and improving and having the courage to examine his own limitations in service of that larger mission. As he left Quantico that day, Marcus Thompson was no longer the same Marine who had walked into O'Malley's pub 6 months earlier. He was someone who had been broken down and rebuilt, someone who had learned that true leadership required humility, wisdom, and the courage to change. The transformation had been painful, but necessary, and it had made him not just a better Marine, but a better human being. The Marine Corps had given him a second chance, and he was determined to prove worthy of that trust while helping to create an institution that truly lived up to its highest ideals.